Fearful Symmetry Fridays number 15. Last week I went over some of the metaphorical conceptions William Blake uses to place man in the universe, and how Northrop Frye interprets that in his book Fearful Symmetry. And this week I want to get into something in the chapter called The City of God and the Final Synthesis. And it's part 4 of this chapter. And Northrop Frye, as he tends to do, gets into a whole lot of things, a whole lot of subjects in this part. Some of which is understanding the Bible as Blake understood it, and he uses Blake's Jerusalem as a way to, and that's his epic poem Jerusalem, as a way to help us understand how Blake understood the Bible. So I'll start here with him talking about clothing. Most of the references to clothing in the Bible represent the transparent net which the fallen world flings around us, woven by Vela, who also weaves armor of conflict, shells of stupidity, or coverings of concealment and shame, like the fig leaves of Adam and Eve. The swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus are a sign of his descent to a fallen world, and the curtains of the ark and the veil of the temple which concealed the nothingness of the Pharisees' God, and which was rent by Jesus, need no further explanation. As the story of Joseph is an account of the fall, the coat of many colors is a symbol corresponding to the coats of skin made for Adam and Eve, and to what those coats represent, their exile from a paradise of innocence, now guarded by the covering cherub, the monstrous dragon, who glitters in gold and precious stones. If we understand this association of ideas, we should be able to follow such a passage as this. The reference to one man's loins will be explained later. Quote, "The eternal man walketh among us, calling us his brothers and his friends, forbidding us the veil which Satan puts between Eve and Adam, by which the princes of the dead enslave their votaries, teaching them to form the serpent of precious stones and gold, to seize the sons of Jerusalem and plant them in one man's loins, to make one family of contraries, that Joseph may be sold into Egypt for negation, a veil the Savior born, and dying rends. On the other hand, the seamless garment of the cross and the linen clothes abandoned by Jesus in his tomb represent the imagination's escape from this through another power, of which Blake gives us a glimpse in his remarkable picture of the Solicitous Fates in Plate 59. This is the power of seeing the physical appearance as the covering of the mental reality, yet not concealing its shape so much as revealing it in a fallen aspect, and so not the clothing, but the body or form of the mental world, though a physical and therefore a fallen body or form. If we try to visualize this development of the clothing symbol, we get something more like a mirror, a surface which reveals reality in fewer dimensions than it actually has. The ambiguity of the meaning of the wheel in Blake's symbolism has often met us before. There is a tree of life and a tree of mystery, a city of God and a city of destruction, a hell of eternal delight and a hell of frustrated desire. It seems an easy inference that all images whatever may be symbols of the world of innocence when thought of in terms of eternal existence, and symbols of the world of experience when thought of in terms of death and annihilation. No class of natural images then can be identified with either world. Prisons belong solely to experience, but a prison is a building, and so is Galganuza. The world in which we live therefore contains a heaven, or imaginative world, in which all natural objects have a mental significance, and a hell, or ulro, in which the same natural objects have an opposite significance. The latter is thus a parody or mirror image, vegetable glass as Blake calls it, of the world of mental reality. In Jerusalem, Blake expresses this relationship by the term analogy. He uses the word only twice, but once in a very crucial place, and as the idea it signifies is about the most important one in Jerusalem, and has no other word attached to it, we shall proceed to make extensive use of it. The occurrence of the word may raise the question whether Bishop Butler's analogy of religion had any influence on Jerusalem. Blake, though he was not likely to read such a book through without some powerful stimulus, may have read the first 20 pages of practically anything, and there is no reason why Butler's book should be an exception either way to that important principle. To what extent this constitutes influence, the writer is not prepared to say, but the complete argument of each would have horrified the other. Butler attempted to refute Deism by establishing an analogy between a known series of facts with which natural reason deals, and an unknown series which is revealed to us by faith. But the attempt to show that reason is limited by the unknown is, according to Blake, itself a cardinal doctrine of Deism, and a logical compulsion to accept an ultra-rational mystery confirms Deism instead of destroying it. It is a paradox to associate revelation, or vision, with what we do not know rather than with what we can see. Though the word analogy is new, this conception of the world of experience as a parody or inverted form of the imaginative world has often come up before. It is implicit in Blake's doctrine that truth consolidates error into an increasingly obvious negation of itself until it becomes pure negation and disappears. It is implicit in his contrast between the identity and the similitude, the image which means itself because it is itself, and the image which means something else because it is like something else, the true and the false allegory. Blake's tiger is allegory. The British lion is an allegory of something. But what it is an allegory of, the reality from which it has been abstracted, is ultimately the real lion. It is implicit, again, in the principle discussed in the 3rd chapter that many aspects of life in the fallen world are inverted or perverted forms of imaginative realities. The heroic leader is the analogy of the visionary prophet. Monogamous marriage is an analogy of the emanation, and, to get nearer the symbolism of Jerusalem, history and law are the analogy of the Word, Canaan the analogy of the Promised Land, Antichrist the analogy of Christ, and so on. We have also noticed that the 4 parts of Jerusalem are each based on an imaginative contrast of a similar kind. If we now go back to the wheel, with which the discussion began, we have a basis for explaining the central point of the argument of Jerusalem. There are 2 poles in human thought, the conception of life as eternal existence in one divine man, and the conception of life as an unending series of cycles in nature. Most of us spend our mental lives vacillating somewhere between these 2, without being fully conscious of either, certainly without any great impulse to accept either. But the rise of Deism has increased our awareness of the extent to which we are attracted by the latter. Between the beginning of life in our world and ourselves, a long interval of time may have elapsed, and a great development have taken place, but the beginning of our world cannot have been, from a natural point of view, anything more than an incident in the revolving stars in the sky. As soon as our idea of a beginning of time or creation disappears into these, quote, starry wheels, we have attained the complete fallen vision of the world, the Orc cycle, the wheel of death, the conclusion from the premises of Bacon and Locke. As the rebirth of Orc is the rebirth of a different individual of the same class, unending recurrence does not necessarily mean that the same thing happens over and over, but that the same kind of thing happens over and over. Such an idea, Blake insists, is a mental cancer. Man is not capable of accepting it purely as an objective fact. Its moral and emotional implications must accompany it into the mind, and breed there into cynical indifference, short-range vision, selfish pursuit of expediency, and all other diseases of the selfhood, ending in horror and despair. But we cannot shut our eyes and deny its reality. We must see its reality as a reflected image of the eternal mental life of God and man, the wheel of life, the automotive energy of the risen body. Jerusalem attempts to show that the vision of reality is the other one inside out. And here's where this, as an aside, as an interjection, my reading is going to be interrupted because the preview in Google Books is going to end right on this page. But I'll continue, and then I'll jump to my own copy. So, Jerusalem attempts to show that the vision of reality is the other one inside out. The poem shows us two worlds, one infinite, the other indefinite. One our own home, and the other the same home receding from us. The poem shows us two worlds, one infinite, the other indefinite. One our own home, and the other the same home receding from us in a mirror. If we recall the image of the vortex or spiral, which was used in Milton, we may see these two worlds as coming together in the shape of a vast hourglass, the brain of man being their infinitesimal point of contact. Now here I will interject once more. I read about this vortex last week. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to touch on this chapter now, because it is something I went over last week, or that Northrop Frye mentioned last week. And if you listen here, this infinitesimal point of contact is something that might sound familiar from Jordan Peterson as he talks about the metaphorical world, maybe the truest thing that there can be, the truest mode of being, kind of touching, the metaphorical touching, coming in contact with us as human beings in reality. And perhaps Jesus was that instance where the metaphorical truth touched upon our literal truth, our historical truth. I'll now continue as Northrop Frye writes, the process of reflection in Locke's philosophy therefore really does reflect, and the more clearly it does so, the more clearly it reflects Blake's vision. The most myopic form of common sense tries to identify appearance and reality, to deny the existence of any reality except the physical world. Such a fool, if he would persist in his folly, would become wise. Now that's a quote from Blake's, I believe, his Marriage of Heaven and Hell. For the work of the greatest artists begins in an attempt to make the appearance real, and ends in an attempt to make reality appear. I thought that was wonderfully phrased. I'm going to read it again. For the work of the greatest artists begins in an attempt to make the appearance real, and ends in an attempt to make reality appear. The assumption underlying art, then, is that the natural world is related to the mental world as material is related to form, diversity to unity, the analytic to the synthetic aspect of the same thing. In the indefinite view of the world, as it is illustrated in Locke, man is a subject contemplating an object, an undividable unit of perception, trying to break down a world outside him into a corresponding aggregate of undividable units, which are called atoms, when they are too small to be seen, and stars, when they are too large to be mentally organized. This is called understanding, a word suggesting the pose of Atlas with the physical world on his head. And what the understanding stands under is substance, which sounds like a Latin form of the same word. In this position, man's conceptions of both subject and object are oppressed by a mystery. He knows vaguely that there is something behind him, that he is not a wholly self-contained unit of perception, and that as an individual he is part of something more than an aggregate. But what the form of this could be he does not know. He knows, too, that there is something behind what he sees, which Locke calls a substratum of substance, for an attempt to define mystery can only be a pleonasm. His mental equipment consists, then, of an objective destiny, or predictable nature, a subjective ratio, and a vacuum, all that is left to him of the three persons in an indivisible substance with which the Christian cycle of natural reasoning began, and this is what leads him to the vision of life as indefinite recurrence. But in such a vision, subject and object have taken the same form, the starry wheels of the solar and vegetable cycles in nature being a process which includes a natural cycle of his own life. Hence, when the Lockian view of reality becomes complete, it becomes exhausted. When man's mind becomes wholly a function of nature, nature becomes a mental category. The attempt to see subject and object in terms of units thus becomes an attempt to see them in terms of unity. But at that point, the whole Orc vision turns inside out. In terms of unity, individuals, atoms, and stars are no longer simply undividable units. They are all equally corpuscles, little bodies within a larger body. And as this larger body must be common to both subject and object, the mystery of what is behind the subject and the mystery of what is behind the object reveal one another and become the same thing, the universal form of both, and the body of God who perceives through man. This is a theory of knowledge in which the word theory has recovered its original sense of seeing, and is no longer a matter of fumbling in the dark for a substratum or for unknown powers of the soul. Such a reversal of perspective in space will include one in time, as our existence in time is only a small cogwheel within the whole astral machine which we perceive in space. But as the unfallen perspective is the reverse of this, and contains the whole of perception within the eternal existence of man's mind, the focal point of the analogy which the indefinite world reflects back to the infinite one must be sought for in time. And as the Bible presents the imaginative form of time, we have now to apply Blake's doctrine of the analogy to the interpretation of the Bible, which he gives us. The Bible begins with a world of watery chaos and a pair of spiritual infants in a garden who grow up in a wilderness. But by the time we have reached the end, we realize that the Bible, like other epics, has started with the action fairly well advanced, and that the book of Genesis needs a prelude about a fiery city in which a single divine and human body formed the circumference of the whole of nature. Such a prelude, if we could be sufficiently inspired to compose one, would turn out to be very similar to the conclusion of the existing book of Revelation. All things have proceeded from a divine man, the body of Jesus, and will be reabsorbed into him, and the total vision of life must have a circular form. But if the Bible had begun where it now ends, it would have presented its vision in a closed circle, and a closed circle would have suggested, as some Indian visions are said to do, the indefinite recurrence not only of natural cycles, but of the whole progression of life itself from fall to apocalypse. This in Blake's symbolism would be the triumph of the spectre of Urthona, the sense of unending time over his master loss, the vision of time as a single form, and would utterly pervert the biblical meaning of the word eternity. The final comprehension of the Bible's meaning is the spark of illumination between its closing anode and its opening cathode, and if that gap were not there, the Bible would not stimulate the imagination to the effort of comprehension, which recreates instead of passively following the outline of a vision. Each reader must discover in his own way, therefore, that the true Eden is not a garden, but a civilized kingdom, and the larger human body of God, or Jesus. This is where the national tradition to be incorporated with the Bible comes in, and the reader will identify this kingdom with the spiritual form of his own nation, which is Atlantis in the case of England. But the Jesus we attain by this process of pulling the Bible around in a circle is polarized by the Jesus who stands opposite him in the middle of the biblical narrative. Here again is the contrast between the present Jesus of vision and the past Jesus of history, which we met in the preceding chapter, and the thought suggests itself that somehow the Jesus of the Gospels is an analogy or reflected form of the true Jesus. I'm going to end the reading right there, because he goes on and it gets more complicated but more interesting. I might save that for next week's Fearful Symmetry, as this is getting a little bit lengthy for what I want this video series to be. So as you can see, Frye went over a whole lot there, and it's interesting, as always, to think about everything he went over there. Again, he's going over Blake's attack of deism and his conception of us in reality, and what reality really is. It's a reflection of the true reality that we find in our imaginations and our present vision in ultimately Jesus. So that will be this week's Fearful Symmetry. If you like this sort of thing, please give the video a like and subscribe. Thank you.